I'm Elena. I'm 26 years old, and 10 minutes ago, my own sister stood up at my wedding reception and told 200 guests that my marriage was a budget bin tragedy. The air in the community hall was thick and humid. I could smell the scent of the cheap lilies I had picked out myself from the local market. They were starting to wilt under the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling. I sat at the head table, my hands trembling slightly against the plastic tablecloth. I looked down at my dress. It wasn't designer. It was a simple, off-the-rack lace gown that I had found on sale. To me, it felt like a dream. To my sister Sarah, it looked like a rag. Sarah stood in the middle of the dance floor, holding a glass of expensive champagne she had brought herself because our sparkling cider wasn't good enough for her. She was wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than my entire wedding budget. Her eyes scanned the room with a look of pure disgust. The mahogany-colored folding chairs, the paper napkins, and the DIY centerpieces. She looked at them like they were trash. "I have to say," Sarah said, her voice echoing through the microphone, "I've seen better decorations at a 5-year-old's birthday party. Honestly, Elena, I'd rather be buried in a ditch than be seen in a venue this pathetic. It's embarrassing to be related to someone with such low standards." The room went deathly silent. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I looked over at my husband, Mark. He looked hurt, his jaw tight, but he held my hand under the table. Then I looked at his father, Arthur. Arthur was a quiet man who lived in a small cabin and drove an old, rusted truck. Sarah had been making fun of him all day, calling him the janitor behind his back. But in that moment of my deepest humiliation, Arthur didn't look embarrassed. He looked at me with a strange, calm smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy box lined with blue velvet. He didn't say a word. He just slid it across the table toward me. Inside was an old, heavy iron key with a gold tag. The room was still staring at Sarah, but I was staring at that key. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream at her. I simply closed my hand over the key and looked my sister in the eye. Before I tell you what that $6 million key opened and how it turned my sister's world upside down, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us tell more stories like this. 1. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The rivalry between Sarah and me didn't start at the wedding. It started when we were children. Sarah was always the golden child. She was 3 years older, taller, and much louder. Our parents worked hard, but we weren't rich. We lived in a small, 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. My father was a mechanic, and my mother worked at the local library. I remember the smell of grease on my father's hands and the scent of old paper that followed my mother home. They were good people. They taught me that value wasn't found in a price tag, but in the effort you put into your life. Sarah, however, learned a different lesson. She saw our parents struggle as a weakness. She hated the used cars and the generic cereal. She spent her entire life trying to run away from our middle-class roots. By the time I was 20, Sarah had married a man named Julian. Julian came from old money. He was arrogant and looked at our family like we were science experiments. Sarah changed the moment she put that diamond ring on her finger. She stopped visiting unless she had something to brag about. She started speaking with a fake high society accent. I, on the other hand, fell in love with Mark. Mark wasn't a millionaire. He was a high school history teacher with a passion for old books and hiking. He was the kind of man who would wake up early to make me coffee just the way I liked it. When he proposed to me on a rainy afternoon in the park, he didn't have a 4-carat diamond. He had a simple gold band that belonged to his grandmother, and I loved it. I loved him. When we announced our engagement at Sunday dinner, Sarah's reaction was exactly what I expected. She didn't hug me. She didn't congratulate Mark. Instead, she took one look at my ring and let out a sharp, cutting laugh. "Oh, Elena," she sighed, swirling her wine glass. "It's cute, very vintage. I suppose it's all a teacher can afford, right? I just hope you aren't planning on having the wedding in a park. I have a reputation to maintain, you know." I felt the familiar sting in my chest. I looked at Mark, who gave me a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. My mother tried to change the subject, talking about the guest list, but Sarah wouldn't stop. You really should let Julian and me pay for a real ring, Sarah continued, her eyes gleaming with a cruel sort of pity. We can't have the neighbors thinking my sister is marrying a pauper. It reflects poorly on us. We're happy, Sarah, I said, my voice quiet but firm. We don't need a big ring or a fancy party to prove that. Sarah just rolled her eyes and turned to Mark's father, Arthur, who was sitting quietly at the end of the table. Arthur had been invited because we wanted the families to bond. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and his hands were rough from years of yard work. And you, Arthur, Sarah said, her voice dripping with condescension. What do you do besides driving that interesting truck I saw in the driveway? Arthur looked up. His eyes were a deep, calm blue. He didn't seem offended by her tone. I'm retired, Sarah, he said simply. I spend most of my time in my garden. I find that the earth gives back exactly what you put into it. Sarah chuckled. A gardener. How charming. Well, I hope you have a nice suit for the wedding. My friends will be there, and they have very high standards for aesthetics. I watched as Arthur just nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It was a smile I didn't understand yet. I didn't know that Arthur was watching Sarah just as closely as she was judging him. I didn't know that this simple gardener was about to become the most important person in my life. The months leading up to the wedding were a battlefield of suggestions and concerns from Sarah. Every time I picked a venue, she told me it was too suburban. Every time I showed her a flower arrangement, she told me it looked cheap. But the real trouble started when she met the rest of Mark's family. She was convinced that because they weren't flashy, they were beneath her. She had no idea that some secrets are kept in the smallest, most unassuming boxes. And she certainly didn't know that her cruelty was being recorded in the mind of a man who held the keys to a fortune she could only dream of. As the wedding day approached, the tension grew. Sarah began to plan a surprise that she claimed would show everyone what a real celebration looked like. But as I sat there at the altar, humiliated by her speech, I realized her surprise was nothing but poison. However, as my fingers traced the cold metal of the key Arthur had given me, I realized something else. Sarah thought she was the one with the power. She thought her money made her a queen and me a peasant. But as I looked at the gold tag on the key, I saw a name etched into it. A name that made my blood run cold and my heart race. Why did Arthur have a key to a place that shouldn't even exist? The silence of the wedding hall felt different now. It was no longer the silence of embarrassment, but the silence of a heavy secret sitting in the palm of my hand. As I looked at the old iron key, my mind drifted away from the flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of wilting lilies. I found myself wandering back through the hallways of my childhood, trying to understand how Sarah and I had ended up on such different paths. We grew up in a house where the floorboards creaked in the winter and the kitchen always smelled of cinnamon and floor wax. My mother was a woman of quiet grace. She believed that a person's character was built in the small moments, how you treated a waiter, how you mended a torn hem, or how you listened when someone else was speaking. My father was the same. He spent his days under the hoods of cars, his knuckles often bruised and stained with oil, but his heart was the softest thing I knew. Always look for the soul of a thing, Elena, he used to tell me while I watched him work in the garage. A shiny coat of paint can hide a rusted engine, and a rusted frame can hold a powerful heart. Don't be fooled by the surface. I took those words to heart. I grew up finding beauty in the way the sunlight hit the dust, motes in the library where my mother worked. I loved the feeling of a well-worn book and the comfort of a homemade sweater. To me, luxury was a long conversation over a cup of tea. Sarah, however, was born looking for the shine. Even as a little girl, she would cry if her shoes weren't the brand everyone else was wearing. She didn't want the homemade sweaters. She wanted the ones from the glossy catalogs. She saw our parents' humility not as a virtue, but as a failure. She viewed my father's grease-stained hands as a source of shame rather than a symbol of his hard work. Why can't we have a pool like the Millers? She would demand at the dinner table, her eyes narrow and filled with a hunger that scared me. Why do we have to drive this clunker of a car? It makes a noise every time we pull into the school parking lot. Everyone looks at us. My mother would sigh, her eyes tired but kind. We have everything we need, Sarah. We have a roof, we have food, and we have each other. That is more than most. It's not enough, Sarah would hiss, and she spent the rest of her life making sure she got enough. As we entered our teenage years, the gap between us became a canyon. Sarah became a master of social climbing. She chose her friends based on the size of their houses and the labels on their bags. She was beautiful, yes, but it was a sharp kind of beauty, like a diamond that could cut you if you touched it the wrong way. I remember one afternoon when I was 16, I had spent all my savings from my part-time job at the bakery to buy a small, handcrafted leather journal for Sarah's birthday. I had seen her looking at a similar one in a boutique, and I thought it would be the perfect place for her to write her dreams. When she opened it, she didn't smile. She didn't even say thank you. She turned the journal over in her hands, her lip curling in a way that I would eventually see 1,000 times more. Is this fake leather? She asked, her voice flat. It's real, Sarah. A local artist made it, I said, my heart sinking. She tossed it onto her bed like it was a piece of junk mail. It doesn't have a logo, Elena. What's the point of carrying something if nobody knows it's expensive? You really have no taste. You're just like Mom and Dad, content with being local and simple. I'm going to be more than that. And she was. Sarah moved out the day she turned 18. She worked jobs she hated just to buy clothes she couldn't afford, until she finally met Julian. Julian was the golden ticket she had been searching for. He was the son of a real estate mogul, a man who treated people like chess pieces. Sarah didn't love him for his mind or his heart. She loved him for the black credit card in his wallet and the way people looked at her when she walked into a room on his arm. When she got married, her wedding was a spectacle of white roses and crystal chandeliers. It cost more than our parents' house was worth. She spent the entire night pointing out the cost of everything to anyone who would listen. She didn't look at Julian with love. She looked at the room with a sense of conquest. I sat at the back of that wedding, feeling like a stranger in my own family. I watched my parents sit uncomfortably in their rented formal wear, looking like they wanted to disappear. Sarah didn't even acknowledge them in her speech. She thanked the caterers and the wedding planners, but she forgot the people who had raised her. That was the day I realized that my sister and I lived in two different worlds. In my world, love was the foundation. In hers, money was the only language spoken. When I met Mark a few years later, I felt like I had finally found someone who spoke my language. Mark didn't care about the labels on my clothes or the car I drove. He liked the way I laughed when I was nervous and the way I remembered the names of all the stray cats in the neighborhood. But when I brought Mark home to meet the family, I knew Sarah would be the ultimate test. I remembered the way she looked at people who didn't measure up. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as we pulled up to my parents' house for Sunday dinner. Mark noticed. He took my hand, his palm warm and steady. Hey, he whispered. It's just dinner. Don't worry so much. You don't know my sister, I replied. She doesn't just judge, she dissects. Let her, Mark said with a shrug. I'm a history teacher. I've dealt with much tougher critics than a woman in a designer dress. But as we walked inside, I saw Sarah already sitting at the table. She was wearing a dress that looked like it belonged on a runway, her hair perfectly coiffed. Next to her, Julian was looking at his watch as if he were being held hostage. And then there was Arthur. Mark's father had arrived early. He was sitting in the corner, holding a glass of iced tea, wearing his favorite worn-out flannel shirt. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life in the sun, peaceful and grounded. Sarah's eyes flicked from Mark's sensible shoes to Arthur's calloused hands, and I saw the predator in her wake-up. She didn't see a kind man or a loving father. She saw targets. So, Sarah began, her voice smooth and dangerous. Elena tells me you're a teacher, Mark. That must be fulfilling. Though I imagine the salary barely covers the gas for that sensible sedan in the driveway. I felt the air leave the room, but Mark just smiled. It was the same calm smile his father had. It covers what we need, Mark said. And the stories I get to tell are worth more than a paycheck. Sarah laughed, a cold, sharp sound. Stories don't buy houses in the hills, darling. But I suppose for some people, enough is a very small number. She then turned her gaze toward Arthur. And you, Arthur. Elena says you're retired. I assume from a very physical line of work. Your hands look like they've seen quite a bit of labor. Arthur took a slow sip of his tea. They have, Sarah. They've built things. They've planted things. They've held things together when they were falling apart. Sarah smirked, leaning back in her chair. How poetic. Well, I hope you brought your muscles, because this wedding Elena is planning sounds like it's going to be a very DIY affair. I imagine you'll be the one hauling the folding chairs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her to stop, but Arthur just nodded. I'll do whatever is needed, he said softly. As the dinner went on, I watched the way Sarah treated Arthur, like he was the help, like he was invisible. She had no idea that Arthur was observing her with a quiet intensity. She didn't see the way he looked at the iron key he kept in his pocket, or the way he looked at me with a mixture of sadness and hope. Why was Arthur being so patient with her? And what did he see in me that made him think I was the one who deserved the secret he was hiding? The weeks following that first dinner were a blur of nervous excitement and mounting dread. Mark and I had decided on a date in early June. We wanted the wedding to feel like a garden in bloom. Simple, fresh, and full of life. We found a community hall near a park that had high ceilings and large windows that let in the golden afternoon light. It wasn't a ballroom with crystal chandeliers, but to us it was perfect. We invited our families to a small brunch at our apartment to officially announce the date. Our apartment was small, filled with secondhand bookshelves and plants that I spent too much time watering. It was cozy, but I knew that to Sarah it would feel like a closet. I spent the morning baking cinnamon rolls. I wanted the air to smell like home, hoping the sweetness would soften the sharp edges of my sister's tongue. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath. Mark squeezed my hand. Remember, he whispered, it's our life, not hers. My parents arrived first, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. They looked around our humble home with genuine pride. My mother touched the lace runner on our small dining table, her eyes misting over. It's beautiful, Elena. It feels like you. Then came Sarah and Julian. Sarah walked in like she was entering a hazardous waste zone. She didn't remove her designer sunglasses immediately, as if the modest light of our apartment might hurt her eyes. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that looked like it cost more than our car. Julian followed behind her, already checking his phone for stock updates. Oh, Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave as she looked at our mismatched chairs. It's very bohemian, isn't it? I didn't realize people still lived in buildings without a doorman. We like it here, Sarah, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Sit down. The rolls are fresh. Sarah sat on the edge of her chair, looking as though she feared she might catch poverty if she sat back too far. Arthur arrived last. He walked in with a gentle smile, carrying a small jar of honey he'd harvested from his own hives. He looked perfectly content in our small space, nodding politely to everyone. So, Sarah began, ignoring the food I had spent hours preparing. Let's talk about this wedding. I assume you've come to your senses and realized that a garden party is just code for we can't afford a roof? We've booked the St. Jude's Community Hall, I said, leaning forward. The one by the lake. It has beautiful views, and we can do the decorations ourselves. It's going to be very intimate. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah put her sunglasses on the table with a slow, deliberate click. A community hall? She repeated, as if I had said we were getting married in a dumpster. Elena, you cannot be serious. People have bingo nights there. The floors are probably sticky with spilled soda. Our cousins from the city are coming. What will they think? I don't care what they think, I said, though my heart was starting to race. I care about marrying Mark. We want to start our lives without a mountain of debt. We're being responsible. Julian looked up from his phone and chuckled. Responsible is just a word people use when they lack ambition, Elena. A wedding is a branding event. It shows the world where you stand on the social ladder. Right now, you're standing in the basement. Mark cleared his throat. We're standing exactly where we want to be, Julian, with people we love. Sarah leaned over, her eyes burning with a strange kind of intensity. Listen to me. I will not have my sister's wedding be the laughingstock of the season. I'll give you the name of my planner. She's expensive, but she can turn even a tragedy like this into something passable. I'll even pay for the catering, provided you let me choose the menu. No one wants DIY sandwiches. I looked at Arthur. He was quiet, stirring his coffee with a silver spoon. He didn't look angry, he looked observant. He was watching Sarah's face, taking in every sneer and every cruel word. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But we want to do this our way. We've already started the budget." "The budget?" Sarah laughed, a sharp, metallic sound. "Honey, you don't have a budget. You have a collection of coupons. It's pathetic. You're settling for a cheap life because you're marrying a man with a cheap future." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Mark's face went pale, but he didn't snap back. He was too dignified for that. "My future is full of things that money can't buy, Sarah," Mark said softly. Sarah stood up, smoothing her jacket. "Well, enjoy your simple life. Just don't come crying to me when you realize that love doesn't pay the rent or buy the pearls. If you insist on this budget wedding, don't expect me to pretend I'm impressed." She walked out, Julian trailing behind her like a shadow. My parents looked heartbroken, and I felt a tear finally slide down my cheek. I felt small. I felt like the cheap sister she always made me out to be. That's when Arthur stood up. He walked over to me and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. "Don't let her noise drown out your music, Elena," he said. His voice was like a deep cello, calm and grounding. "The most valuable things in this world are often hidden in plain sight. She looks for the glitter, but she misses the gold." He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against something. For a moment, I thought he was going to show me something right then, but he stopped. "The wedding will be exactly what it needs to be," Arthur continued. "And you might find that the cheap hall holds more wealth than any ballroom Sarah has ever stepped foot in." I thanked him, but at the time, I thought he was just being a kind, supportive father-in-law, trying to make me feel better about being poor. I didn't see the way he looked at the door Sarah had just slammed. I didn't see the cold, calculating look in his eyes, a look that said he had seen enough of Sarah's character to make a final decision. Why was Arthur so confident that our wedding would be wealthy? And what was the secret he was keeping from all of us, hidden under his worn-out flannel shirts and humble garden stories? In the weeks that followed, the budget battle didn't just stay in our apartment, it followed me everywhere like a cold, persistent shadow. Sarah didn't take my no for an answer. Instead, she decided to turn my wedding planning into her own personal project of psychological warfare. Every morning, I would wake up to a flurry of text messages, links to five-star venues, photos of $1,000 flower arrangements, and gentle reminders that a woman of my family's standing should have a certain level of dignity. I sat at my kitchen table one Tuesday morning, a notebook spread out before me. I was trying to figure out how to stretch our small savings to cover the catering for 100 people. The sunlight was pale, filtering through the thin curtains, and the steam from my coffee rose in a slow, lazy swirl. I was focused on the numbers, my brow furrowed, when the doorbell rang. It was Sarah. She didn't wait to be invited in. She marched into the kitchen, smelling of expensive jasmine and cold air. She dropped a heavy, glossy folder onto my budget notes. "I've done it for you," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "I spoke to the manager at the Grand Estate. They had a cancellation for your date. It's only 3 times your budget, but Julian and I will cover the difference. You can stop playing house with your little notebook now." I looked at the folder. The cover showed a massive stone mansion with a fountain that looked like it belonged in a palace. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. "Sarah, I told you," I said, my voice low and weary. "We want the community hall. We want to do this ourselves. We don't want your money." Sarah's face hardened. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her jewelry clinking against the wood. "Why are you being so stubborn, Elena? Is it pride? Because, let me tell you, pride is a very cold blanket when you're living in a dump. This cheap wedding isn't just a reflection of you, it's a reflection of me. People will ask why the sister of Sarah Miller is getting married in a place that smells like floor wax and old gym socks. Maybe you should tell them it's because your sister is happy, I countered. Happiness doesn't look good in photos, she snapped. I saw the catering menu you were looking at. Tacos? You're serving tacos at a wedding? It's a disgrace. Our mother is already telling the neighbors about your rustic theme, which we all know is just a polite word for broke. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. I thought about Mark, and I thought about the quiet kindness of Arthur. It's a celebration of love, Sarah, not a parade for your friends. Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing. You think you're so noble, don't you? Living this simple life. But look at you. You're stressed. You're counting pennies. You're marrying a man who will never be able to give you the world. And Mark's father? That man is a ghost. He wanders around in those rags, probably living off a tiny pension. Do you want that to be your future? Do you want to be 70 years old and still counting the cost of eggs? She reached into her purse and pulled out a check. She slid it across the table toward me. It was for $20,000. Take it, she whispered. Call the estate. Fix this disaster before it starts. Consider it a gift from someone who actually cares about how the world sees you. I looked at the check. It was more money than I had seen in years. For a split second, a tiny part of me, the part that Sarah had spent years making feel small, wanted to take it. It would make everything so easy. No more DIY centerpieces. No more worrying about the guest list. But then I saw the way Sarah was looking at me. She wasn't looking at me with love. She was looking at me with ownership. If I took that money, I would be her project for the rest of my life. I would be the charity case she talked about at her cocktail parties. I picked up the check and handed it back to her. No, thank you, I said. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my hand was steady. Sarah stared at the check, then at me. Her face went pale with rage. Fine, she hissed, stuffing the paper back into her bag. Have your little tragedy of a wedding, but don't expect me to lie for you. When people ask why it's so cheap, I'll tell them the truth. I'll tell them you chose this. You chose to be a nobody. She slammed the door on her way out, leaving me in the silence of my kitchen. I felt shaky and exhausted. I needed to clear my head. A few hours later, I drove out to Mark's father's house. Arthur lived about 40 minutes outside the city, at the end of a long, winding dirt road. His house was a small, silver-shingled cottage tucked behind a grove of ancient oak trees. It was the kind of place that felt like it had grown out of the ground rather than being built on it. When I arrived, I found Arthur in the back garden. He was kneeling in the dirt, his hands buried in the soil near a row of bright blue hydrangeas. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Rough day, Elena? He asked without looking up. He had a way of knowing things without being told. I sat down on a stone bench nearby. Sarah came over. She offered a lot of money to change the venue. She said some things, Arthur. Cruel things. About the wedding, about Mark, and about you. Arthur stopped digging. He sat back on his heels and wiped his brow with the back of a gloved hand. She thinks I'm a poor old man, doesn't she? She doesn't see you at all, I said softly. She only sees what people own. She called you a ghost. Arthur let out a soft, dry chuckle. A ghost. I suppose that's true in a way. I've spent a long time being invisible. It's easier to see the world when you aren't the center of attention. He stood up, his joints popping slightly, and walked over to me. He looked at my budget notebook, which I had brought with me in my bag. Don't let her take the joy out of the work, Elena, he said. The best things in life aren't the ones that are handed to you in a glossy folder. They're the ones you build with your own two hands. They have your soul in them. He looked toward his small house, his eyes reflective. Sarah thinks money is a shield. She thinks it protects her from being ordinary, but she's wrong. Money is a mirror. It only shows you who you really are. And right now, her mirror is showing something very ugly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin. He turned it over in his fingers. I have something for you, Elena. Not for the wedding, but for after. A gift for the kind of person who knows the value of a cheap haul. What is it? I asked. Arthur smiled, a secret glint in his eyes. Not yet. A gift is only good when the timing is right. For now, you just keep planning your beautiful DIY wedding. And remember, the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange sense of strength. Arthur was right. Sarah was loud, but she was empty. But as the days went on, I started to notice something strange. People who had originally said they couldn't come to the wedding were suddenly calling me back, saying they had changed their minds. And the vendors I was talking to, the florist, the baker, started giving me discounts that seemed too good to be true. When I asked the florist why she was giving me half off the roses, she just winked and said, "An old friend made a call. Don't worry about it, honey." Who was this old friend? And why was a simple gardener like Arthur suddenly seeming like the man behind the curtain of my entire life? The discounts and the sudden change in guest availability were strange, but I was too busy to investigate. My focus was on the upcoming weekend. Mark and I had invited my parents and Sarah over to Arthur's cottage for a family workday. We needed to prep some of the handmade favors, and Arthur had offered his large wooden porch as a workspace. I knew Sarah would hate it. I knew she would find the dirt road and the lack of air conditioning beneath her, but I wanted us all to be together. I still held a small, naive hope that if she saw the piece of Arthur's life, she might finally understand why I loved this family. The drive out to the cottage was beautiful. The trees were a vibrant deep green, and the air cooled as we left the city behind. Mark was humming a tune, his hand resting on the gearshift of our old sedan. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at me. "You've been staring at that blue velvet box Arthur gave you at the house the other day." "I'm just curious, Mark," I said, tracing the edge of the box in my lap. He said it was for after. "But why give it to me now? And why an iron key? It looks like it belongs to a castle, not a house." Mark shrugged, a soft smile on his face. "My dad has always been a man of mystery. He doesn't have much, but what he has, he cherishes. Maybe it's just a symbol. You know how he is." When we pulled into the gravel driveway, my parents were already there, helping Arthur move some heavy wooden crates. Sarah's car, a sleek silver sports car, was parked as far away from the dusty trees as possible. Sarah was standing on the porch, holding her phone high in the air, trying to find a signal. She looked like a misplaced statue in her white silk blouse and designer jeans. "There is literally 0 bars out here," she grumbled as we walked up. "How does anyone live like this? It's like the Dark Ages. And the smell? Is that manure?" "It's jasmine and fresh pine, Sarah," I said, stepping onto the porch. "It's called nature." Arthur came around the corner, wiping his brow. He was wearing an old, faded denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up, showing arms that were surprisingly lean and muscular for a man of his age. He smiled at us, his eyes crinkling. "Welcome, everyone," Arthur said. "I've got the tables set up. We've got 100 jars of honey to label and some lace to trim for the invitations." Sarah looked at the jars of honey as if they were live grenades. "Wait, you're actually giving away honey? Like, from bees?" "Elena, that is so. Farmer's market. Why didn't you just order the crystal wine stoppers I sent you the link for?" "Because this honey comes from Arthur's hives," I explained patiently. "It's personal. It means something." Sarah let out a long, dramatic sigh and sat down at the wooden table. She picked up a label, her long, manicured nails making it difficult to peel the backing. For the next hour, she did more complaining than working. Every time a bug flew near her, she shrieked. Every time Julian's name popped up on her phone, she took the call and walked away, leaving her work for my mother to finish. Arthur stayed quiet. He sat at the end of the table, his large hands moving with incredible precision as he tied small pieces of twine around the jars. He watched Sarah. He watched the way she spoke to our mother, demanding a glass of water, complaining that the chair was splintery. He watched the way she looked at his small, modest home with pity. "So, Arthur," Sarah said, finally putting her phone down, "how long have you lived in this cabin? It's very minimalist. I assume the upkeep on a place this old must be a nightmare. You should really think about a retirement home." Julian's firm just built a luxury one in the city. It has a spa. Arthur didn't look up from his twine. I like it here, Sarah. It's quiet. A man can hear his own thoughts. In the city, everyone is so busy trying to be heard that they forget how to listen. Sarah smirked. That's a very nice way of saying you can't afford to live in the city. It's okay to admit it. We're all family here. Well, mostly. The insult was sharp, but Arthur just nodded slowly. Affording a place and wanting a place are two different things, Sarah. Some people build walls to keep the world out. I built this porch to let the world in. Right, Sarah drawled, rolling her eyes at me. Anyway, Elena, I hope you've cleared this honey idea with the health department. It would be just like your wedding to end with a mass case of food poisoning. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. The honey is fine, Sarah. Please, just help or be quiet. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the garden, Arthur stood up. I think that's enough for today. Why don't you all come inside? I've made some tea. The inside of Arthur's house was just as simple as the outside. There were books everywhere, shelves that reached the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes on history, architecture, and philosophy. There were no flashy gadgets, no big-screen TVs, just a stone fireplace and comfortable, worn-in chairs. Sarah walked through the living room, her eyes scanning the bookshelves. She pulled a small, dusty book from a shelf and flipped through it. Architecture of the Renaissance? She asked, a mocking lilt in her voice. What do you need this for, Arthur? Planning a shed? I like the way they used to build things, Arthur said, placing a tray of tea on the low table. They built things to last for centuries. They cared about the foundation. Today, people just care about the facade. Sarah tossed the book back onto the shelf carelessly. It hit the wood with a dull thud. Well, facades are what people see. No one cares about the foundation if the house is ugly. Arthur stopped mid-pour. He looked at Sarah for a long beat. It was the first time I saw a flicker of something other than kindness in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was more like a judge passing a sentence. You'd be surprised, Sarah, he said softly. The strongest foundations are often the ones you never see. As we were leaving that night, Arthur walked me to the car. The crickets were loud in the grass and the air was cool and sweet. He leaned in and whispered so only I could hear. Don't worry about her words, Elena. They are like dry leaves in the wind. They make a lot of noise, but they have no weight. He patted my hand, but then he did something strange. He looked toward Sarah's silver car, where she was already sitting, checking her reflection in the visor mirror. Elena, Arthur said, his voice dropping lower. Do you know what that key in your bag is made of? You said iron, I replied, confused. It is, he nodded. But do you know why iron is important? It's because iron doesn't break. It doesn't shine like gold and it doesn't sparkle like silver. But when the fire comes, iron is the only thing left standing. He walked away before I could ask what he meant. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Arthur was standing in his driveway, his small cottage glowing behind him. He looked like a king standing before his castle, even though he was just an old man in a flannel shirt. Why was he talking about fire? And why did I feel like that iron key was becoming heavier every single day? A week after the day at Arthur's cottage, Sarah called me. Her voice was uncharacteristically sweet, like honey poured over a razor blade. She told me she felt guilty about our argument and wanted to take me out for a sister's day. She insisted on taking me to a bridal boutique downtown, a place called Le Toit. I had heard of it. It was the kind of place where you needed an appointment 6 months in advance and a bank account with at least 6 zeros to feel comfortable. I just want you to see what's out there, Elena, Sarah said over the phone. No pressure to buy, just broaden your horizons. For me? Against my better judgment, I agreed. I wore my best sundress, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. When I arrived, the boutique looked more like a museum than a shop. The floors were white marble, and the air was chilled to a perfect crisp temperature. Every dress was displayed on a custom mannequin, glowing under soft focus spotlights. Sarah was already there, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple canvas bag. Oh, good you're here, she said, not bothering to rise. I've already picked out a few things for you to try, just for fun. The saleswoman, a tall, thin woman named Monique, looked at me with a practiced polite coldness. She didn't offer me water. She didn't even offer me a chair. She simply stood by a rack of dresses that looked like they were made of clouds and starlight. This first one, Sarah said, pointing to a gown with a train that must have been 10 feet long, is a custom piece. It's $30,000. Try it on, Elena. I want to see if a budget bride can even carry that much weight. I felt a lump in my throat. Sarah, I'm not buying a $30,000 dress. My dress is already at home. It's simple, and it's paid for. Just try it, Sarah pushed, her smile widening. Don't be a killjoy. I went into the dressing room. The silk was heavy and cold against my skin. The dress was beautiful, undeniably, but when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw a doll. I saw a version of me that belonged to Sarah's world, not Mark's. When I stepped out, Sarah didn't tell me I looked beautiful. She didn't even look at my face. She walked around me, touching the fabric, checking the tags. See? She whispered loud enough for Monique to hear. The fabric doesn't lie. It highlights everything ordinary about you. You look like a girl playing dress up in a queen's closet. It's almost sad, isn't it? Knowing that after today you'll go back to that lace rag you bought at the mall. Monique let out a soft, condescending sniff. The lace on this gown is hand-stitched by artisans in France. It's not for everyone. Some people are simply more comfortable in synthetics. I felt a hot wave of shame wash over me. I wanted to strip the dress off and run out of the store. I felt like a spectacle, a joke for them to enjoy. I've had enough, I said, my voice shaking. I'm going to change. Oh, don't be so sensitive, Sarah laughed. I'm just being honest. I'm the only one who will tell you the truth, Elena. You're trying to have a special day on a standard life. You're going to walk down that aisle in that community hall, and you're going to look back at these photos and realize how small you looked. I walked back into the dressing room and began to unbutton the dress. My hands were fumbling with the tiny silk buttons. I felt a tear sting my eye. I felt small. I felt exactly how Sarah wanted me to feel, like a cheap imitation of a real bride. But then, as I reached into my bag to grab my phone, my hand brushed against the blue velvet box Arthur had given me. I hadn't moved it since the day at the cottage. I pulled it out and opened it. The iron key sat there, dark and heavy. In the sterile, bright light of the boutique, the key looked ancient. It looked real. It didn't have the sparkle of the diamonds on the mannequins, but it had a weight that felt like an anchor. I remembered Arthur's words. Iron doesn't break. I took a deep breath. I put the box back in my bag, finished changing into my own clothes, and walked out. Sarah was looking at a veil that cost more than my car. Ready to go? Or do you want to try the one with the pearls? It might help hide the simplicity of your face. I'm done, Sarah, I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was calm. It was the same tone Arthur used when he spoke to the earth. I don't need these dresses, and I don't need your pity. You spend so much time looking at the price tags that you've forgotten how to look at people. Sarah blinked, surprised by my sudden backbone. Excuse me? You think you're better than me because your life is expensive, I continued, walking toward the door. But you're the one who's poor. You're so afraid of being ordinary that you've become a caricature. Have fun with your French lace, Sarah. I'm going to go marry a man who loves me in synthetics. I walked out of L'Etoile and into the warm afternoon sun. I felt a strange sense of victory. For the first time, Sarah's insults hadn't stuck. They had slid off me like rain off a tin roof. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. Dad just called. He said he wants to take us to lunch tomorrow. He said there's a place he wants to show us before the wedding. Somewhere quiet. You up for it? I smiled, my heart feeling light. Yes, I typed back. But as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Monique and Sarah had looked at me. And I couldn't stop wondering why Arthur, a man who lived in a cabin and wore flannel, had a key that felt like it belonged to a treasury. The next day, when we met Arthur for lunch, he didn't take us to a restaurant. He took us to a tall, iron gate on the outskirts of the city. The gate was covered in ivy and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Arthur, I asked, looking at the rusted bars, what is this place? Arthur pulled a heavy chain from the gate and looked at me. This, Elena, is the foundation. Sarah talks about the facade, but today I want to show you what lies beneath the surface. He reached out his hand, waiting for me to give him the key. My heart began to pound. Was this the moment the secret would finally be revealed? The iron gate stood tall and imposing against the backdrop of the overcast sky. It was beautiful in a haunting way, with intricate metal vines that seemed to choke the life out of the rusted bars. Beyond the gate, I could see a winding driveway made of crushed gray stone, disappearing into a thicket of weeping willow trees. This didn't look like a place a simple gardener would know about, let alone have access to. Arthur, I whispered, my breath hitching in my throat. What is this? Is this where you work? Arthur didn't answer right away. He took the iron key from my hand. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He slid the key into a heavy, hidden lock inside the gate's center pillar. The sound of the mechanism turning was deep and solid, a heavy thunk that echoed through the quiet street. I don't work here anymore, Elena, Arthur said as the gates began to creak open with a slow, mechanical groan. But I've looked after it for a very long time. Think of it as a library of history, a place where the past is kept safe from the noise of the present. Mark looked as confused as I was. Dad, I've lived with you my whole life. You never mentioned a place like this. You always said you were just a caretaker for the local parks. Arthur smiled, that same knowing, secretive smile. A man can be many things, Mark. Sometimes we play the role that the world expects us to play, so we can keep the things that truly matter, private. Now, come. We don't have much time before the rain starts. We drove the car through the gate and up the long, winding path. The willow trees brushed against the roof of the car like ghostly fingers. As we rounded a bend, the trees cleared, and my heart stopped. Sitting in the middle of a perfectly manicured lawn was a sprawling stone manor. It wasn't flashy like the modern mansion Sarah loved. It was old, built from heavy, dark stones that looked like they had been there since the dawn of time. It had massive chimneys and leaded glass windows that reflected the gray clouds. It looked like a fortress, but one built for a family, not an army. This is the Blackwood estate, Arthur said softly. It was built by men who believed that a home should outlast its owners. No plastic, no shortcuts, just stone, wood, and iron. We stepped out of the car. The air here felt different, colder, but more still. I felt a strange sense of belonging, as if the stones themselves were welcoming me home. But even as I marveled at the beauty, a dark thought crossed my mind. If Sarah knew about this place, she would lose her mind. She would find a way to claim it, to use it, to turn it into another one of her branding events. As if reading my mind, Arthur turned to me. This stays between us, Elena. For now. Especially from Sarah. I nodded quickly. I understand. But Arthur, why show us this now? Because, Arthur said, looking up at the high stone arches, the world is going to try to make you feel small in the coming days. Sarah is already moving. She's talking to your parents, Elena. She's trying to convince them that your wedding is a mistake. My heart sank. What do you mean? She's telling them that if they support this budget wedding, they are helping you fail, Arthur explained, his voice grave. She's trying to cut off your support, one person at a time. It's a silent sabotage. She wants you to come crawling to her for that $20,000 check. I felt a wave of nausea. I knew Sarah was competitive, but to turn my own parents against me? To try and ruin the one day that was supposed to be mine? It felt like a betrayal I couldn't forgive. Why is she doing this? I asked, my voice cracking. What did I ever do to her? You chose to be happy without needing what she has, Mark said, stepping closer to me. To Sarah, that's a threat. If you can be happy with a cheap wedding and a simple life, then her entire life, all the money, the labels, the stress, it all becomes meaningless. She has to break you to prove that her way is the only way. Arthur nodded. She thinks she is the one holding all the cards. She thinks wealth is something you display. She doesn't realize that true wealth is something you protect. We spent the next hour walking through the lower floors of the manor. The floors were solid oak, and the walls were lined with tapestries that told stories of old heroes. It was silent, peaceful, and incredibly heavy with history. Arthur didn't say much more, but as we left, he handed the key back to me. "Keep it safe, Elena. And when the night before the wedding comes, and you feel like you have nothing left, remember this stone. It doesn't move. It doesn't break." When I got home that evening, the silent sabotage was already in motion. My mother was sitting in my kitchen, her eyes red from crying. My father was standing by the window, looking out at the street with a heavy expression. "Elena," my mother whispered, clutching a handkerchief. "Sarah came over today. She showed us the bills for her wedding, and then she showed us the expected cost of yours," she said. "The community hall is a fire hazard." She said people are laughing at us behind our backs. "Mom, don't listen to her," I said, rushing to her side. "She's just trying to control everything. She said she'd pay for everything if we just talked some sense into you," my father said, his voice flat. "She said we were being bad parents for letting you embarrass yourself. Maybe she's right, Elena. Maybe we should just let her help. We don't want you to be the talk of the town for the wrong reasons." I looked at my parents, the people who had taught me that value wasn't in a price tag. Sarah had managed to get inside their heads. She had used their love for me as a weapon against my own happiness. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. This was the fire Arthur had talked about. The pressure was mounting, the walls were closing in, and my own family was starting to crack under the weight of Sarah's lies. "I'm not changing my mind," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. "And if you can't support me, then maybe you shouldn't come." The words hurt to say, but I had to stand my ground. My mother sobbed harder, and my father just shook his head and walked out. I was alone in my kitchen, the cheap decorations for the wedding sitting in boxes on the floor, looking suddenly very small and fragile. I reached into my bag and felt the iron key. It was cold. It was hard. It was the only thing that felt real. I wondered if Sarah knew that I held the key to a $6 million estate, would she still be laughing? Or would she be the one crawling? But more importantly, why was Arthur letting me hold it? Was he waiting for me to use it? Or was he waiting for Sarah to go too far? The air was thick with tension as we gathered at a high-end restaurant for the pre-wedding dinner. Sarah had insisted on hosting it. She chose a place where the waiters wore white gloves and the menus didn't have prices. It was her home turf, a place designed to make anyone with a normal life feel out of place. I sat next to Mark, feeling the stiffness of my own posture. I was wearing a simple navy blue dress, while Sarah sat across from us in a shimmering gold gown that caught every flicker of the candlelight. She looked like a queen presiding over a court of peasants. My parents were there too, looking small and uncomfortable. They hadn't looked me in the eye since our argument in the kitchen. And then there was Arthur. He had arrived in his best suit, which was clearly decades old. The wool was a bit thin at the elbows, and the cut was out of style, but he wore it with a quiet dignity. To Sarah, however, he was just an eyesore in her perfectly curated evening. "I took the liberty of ordering for everyone," Sarah announced, not even glancing at the menus in our hands. "I figured the French names might be a bit confusing for some. I went with the Wagyu steak and the truffle risotto. It's a bit more refined than the taco bar Elena is planning for the actual wedding." Julian let out a short, dry laugh. "Well, we have to give them one good meal this week, right? God knows what they'll be eating at that community hall. Cardboard and disappointment?" I felt Mark's hand tighten under the table. I looked at Arthur, expecting him to be offended. Instead, he was calmly unfolding his linen napkin. He looked like he was watching a play rather than participating in a dinner. "The wine is a 2015 vintage," Sarah continued, tilting her glass toward the light. "I'm sure you'll appreciate it, Arthur. It probably costs more than a year's worth of whatever it is you grow in that garden of yours." Arthur took a small sip of the wine. He swirled it in his mouth, his expression thoughtful. "It's a bit young," he said softly. "The tannins haven't quite settled. It's trying too hard to be bold, but it lacks the depth that comes with proper aging. Sarah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She didn't expect the gardener to have an opinion on fine wine. She quickly recovered, her eyes flickering with a cold light. How interesting, she sneered. I didn't realize you were a sommelier, Arthur. I thought you just dealt with dirt and shovels. I've spent a lot of time around things that grow, Arthur replied, his voice calm and steady. Whether it's grapes or people, you learn that you can't rush the process. And you can't fake the quality of the soil. The dinner progressed like a slow-motion car crash. Sarah spent the next hour subtly pointing out the flaws in our wedding plans. She talked about the tacky DIY favors we had made at the cottage. She made fun of the fact that Mark's best man was a fellow teacher instead of someone with influence. But her cruelest move came when the dessert arrived. She leaned forward, looking directly at my mother. You know, Mom, Sarah said, her voice dripping with fake concern. I was talking to some of the cousins today. They're all so worried about the wedding. They're asking if they should bring their own chairs or if there will even be enough food. It's so embarrassing for the family. I told them I tried to help, but Elena, well, she's just being difficult. My mother looked down at her plate, her lip trembling. I just want everyone to be happy, Sarah. Happiness is easier when you aren't a laughingstock, Sarah snapped. She turned to me, her eyes hard. It's not too late, Elena. I have the manager of the estate on speed dial. One call, and we can move the whole thing. You just have to admit that you can't do this on your own. Admit that you're in over your head. I looked around the table. Julian was smirked. My parents were broken. Mark was fuming. And then I looked at Arthur. He was looking at me, his blue eyes intense and encouraging. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it cut through Sarah's monologue like a knife. Excuse me, Sarah asked. I said no, I repeated louder this time. I am not moving the wedding. I am not taking your money. And I am not going to let you use my parents to bully me anymore. If you're so embarrassed to be my sister Sarah, then don't come. Stay home and count your money. I'm sure it will keep you very warm at night. The table went silent. A waiter stopped mid-pour, sensing the shift in the air. Sarah's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. You're a fool, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. You're going to walk into that hall tomorrow and realize that you have nothing. You'll be standing there in your cheap dress, surrounded by cheap people, and you'll realize that I was right. You belong in the dirt, Elena. Arthur stood up then. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He simply straightened his vintage suit jacket. I think we're finished here, Arthur said. He looked at Sarah with a look of profound pity, the kind of look a scientist might give a dying specimen. You speak of dirt, Sarah, as if it's a bad thing. But dirt is where life begins. It's where the strongest trees take root. You live in a world of glass and gold. But glass shatters, and gold is cold. Tomorrow, you'll see what a real foundation looks like. He walked over to me and held out his arm. Come, Elena. Mark, we have work to do. As we walked out of the restaurant, I could hear Sarah's sharp, angry voice behind us calling us, ungrateful and pathetic, but I didn't look back. I felt a strange sense of clarity. The fire was burning, but I wasn't melting. I was hardening. When we got to the parking lot, Arthur stopped me by my car. The city lights were reflecting in the puddles on the ground. She's going to try something tomorrow, Elena, Arthur whispered. She can't let you win. She's going to try to ruin the ceremony itself. I need you to trust me. How? I asked, my heart racing. What is she going to do? It doesn't matter what she does, Arthur said, reaching into his pocket and touching the gold tag on a second key he hadn't shown me yet. Because tomorrow morning I'm making a phone call that I haven't made in 20 years. I want you to go to the hall early. Don't let anyone in except the vendors I sent you. The old friend? I asked. Arthur smiled, and for the first time he looked truly formidable. The old friend is coming home, Elena, and he's bringing the truth with him. What was the phone call? And why did Arthur look like a man preparing for a war he had already won? The sun rose on the morning of my wedding with a soft, hazy light that filtered through my bedroom curtains. I lay there for a moment, the silence of the house feeling heavy and expectant. Today was the day. Today, I was supposed to marry the man I loved in a community hall that my sister had branded a tragedy. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. The world outside looked peaceful, but I could feel the electricity in the air. My phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. I didn't even have to look to know it was a barrage of messages from Sarah. She had been sending reminders all night about the rain forecast and the inevitable failure of the catering. I ignored them. I walked into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the steam rising in the quiet morning. I spent the next hour in a state of focused calm. I did my own makeup, taking my time with the brushes. I brushed my hair until it shone like polished mahogany. I wasn't going to look like a budget bride. I was going to look like myself. Around 9 in the morning, I drove down to the St. Jude's Community Hall. I expected to find it empty, save for a few boxes of decorations, but when I pulled into the parking lot, my heart skipped a beat. There were 3 large black vans parked near the entrance. They didn't have logos on the side, but they looked expensive, sleek and perfectly clean. A group of people in professional black uniforms were moving in and out of the hall with a speed and precision I had never seen. Wait, I muttered to myself, stepping out of the car. I didn't hire these people. I walked toward the entrance, my heels clicking on the pavement. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the scent of old gym socks or floor wax that Sarah had predicted. It was the overwhelming, intoxicating aroma of fresh white roses, jasmine, and damp moss. The hall had been transformed. The harsh fluorescent lights were gone, replaced by hundreds of flickering white candles and soft, warm Edison bulbs strung across the ceiling like stars. The cheap folding chairs had been covered in heavy, cream-colored silk. The walls were draped in sheer linen that softened the entire room, making it look like a dream sequence. In the center of the room stood Arthur. He was wearing his work boots and his old flannel shirt, holding a clipboard. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "Morning, Elena," he said, his voice as calm as ever. The old friend sent a few people over to help with the heavy lifting. I hope you don't mind. Arthur, who are these people? I whispered, looking at a man who was carefully arranging a massive floral arch at the end of the aisle. This must have cost a fortune. I can't pay for this. It's already handled, Arthur said, waving a hand dismissively. Think of it as a gift from someone who values a good foundation. We didn't change your vision, Elena. We just polished it. I walked through the hall, my hand grazing the silk chair covers. It was exactly what I had wanted, but elevated to a level of beauty I hadn't dared to imagine. It was elegant, timeless, and completely silent. But the peace didn't last long. The doors burst open, and Sarah marched in. She was already dressed for the ceremony, wearing a fascinator hat and a dress that looked like it belonged at a royal funeral. She was holding her phone out, likely ready to film the disaster for her social media. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her jaw actually dropped as she looked around the room. Her eyes darted from the silk drapes to the thousands of dollars worth of flowers. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Elena, what did you do? You stole this, didn't you? There is no way you and that school teacher could afford a setup like this." "I didn't do anything, Sarah," I said, staying calm. Friends of the family stepped in. Sarah turned her glare toward Arthur, who was still calmly checking his clipboard. "You. This is your fault. You're playing some kind of game, aren't you? Where did this money come from? Did you rob a bank? Or did you just go into debt to try and make me look bad?" Arthur looked up from his notes. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. "I don't need to try to make you look bad, Sarah. You've been doing an excellent job of that all on your own. As for the money, let's just say some investments finally matured." "Investments?" Sarah laughed, a high, panicked sound. "You live in a shack. You drive a truck that's older than I am. Don't lie to me. This is all a facade. It's fake, probably silk flowers and plastic candles." She reached out to grab a rose from the nearest arrangement, intending to prove it was fake, but her hand stopped. The scent was real. The dew on the petals was real. The thorns were very, very real. This doesn't change anything, Sarah hissed, turning back to me. It's still a community hall. It's still a cheap venue. No amount of flowers can hide the fact that you're a nobody marrying a nobody. She turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels clattering like gunfire on the wooden floor. I looked at Arthur, my heart pounding. She's going to try something, isn't she? I asked. She's not going to let this go. She's already tried, Arthur said. She called the catering company an hour ago, posing as you. She tried to cancel the food delivery. I gasped. What? Is the food coming? Arthur nodded. The old friend anticipated that. The food isn't coming from the local deli anymore, Elena. It's coming from the Blackwood kitchen. And I think your sister is in for a very big surprise when she sees who's serving it. I felt a chill run down my spine. The Blackwood estate was a place of legends, a private fortune that no one in our town really understood. Why was Arthur talking about it like he owned the kitchen? As the guests began to arrive, I retreated to the small dressing room at the back of the hall. I sat in front of the mirror, the iron keys sitting on the table next to me. The mystery was deepening, and the fire Sarah had started was now burning out of her control. I looked at my reflection. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. But as I heard the first notes of the processional music begin to play, I wondered, was this wedding about to become a celebration of love, or the site of a total family collapse? And what would Sarah do when she realized that the man she had been mocking for months was the one who held all the power? The music began, not the tinny recorded sound Sarah had joked about, but the deep, resonant vibration of a live string quartet hidden behind the linen drapes. The notes of the cello felt like they were pulling at my heartstrings. I stood at the back of the hall, clutching my bouquet of simple white lilies. My father stood beside me. He looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his eyes darting toward the floor. He still hadn't apologized for taking Sarah's side, but as he looked at me, I saw a flicker of the man who used to fix my toys in the garage. "You look beautiful, Elena," he whispered. I didn't expect all this. "Neither did I, Dad," I said softly. "Let's just go." As we began the walk down the aisle, the room felt transformed. The warm glow of the Edison bulbs reflected off the silk-covered chairs, and for a moment, the community hall felt larger than any cathedral. I saw our friends, our neighbors, and Mark's fellow teachers. They all looked stunned. And then I saw Sarah. She was sitting in the front row, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She wasn't looking at the flowers or the candles. She was staring at me with a look of pure, concentrated venom. Every step I took felt like a victory over the version of me she had tried to create. She wanted me to look small. Instead, the room made me feel infinite. Mark was waiting for me at the altar. He looked handsome, but more than that, he looked steady. Beside him stood Arthur. Arthur had changed into a dark charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. He didn't look like a gardener anymore. He looked like a patriarch. The ceremony was quiet and intimate. The officiant spoke of love as a foundation, not something built for show, but something built to last. I could hear Sarah's loud, exaggerated whispers from the front row, cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. "Look at the lace on that dress," she whispered to Julian, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You can practically see the plastic threads. And the music? I bet they're paying those kids in sandwiches. It's all a show to hide how broke they are." Julian chuckled a sound like dry paper. "It's a nice try, I guess. But you can't polish a diamond if it's actually just a piece of coal." I felt the sting of her words, but I kept my eyes on Mark. I felt his thumb trace circles on the back of my hand. He was my anchor. I didn't need Sarah's approval. I didn't need her world. But Sarah wasn't done. As we reached the part of the ceremony where the rings were exchanged, she did something I never thought she'd be bold enough to do. She dropped her heavy designer clutch. It hit the wooden floor with a loud, echoing thud, right as the officiant asked for the rings. "Oh, oops," Sarah said, not sounding sorry at all. She bent over slowly, making a show of gathering her things, drawing every eye in the room away from us and toward her. Everything is just so cramped in here, hard to keep track of your belongings when you're squeezed in like sardines. The momentum of the ceremony broke. The guests shifted uncomfortably. My mother looked like she wanted to crawl under her chair. Sarah sat back up, a triumphant smirk on her face. She had reclaimed the spotlight. She had reminded everyone that she was the one with the expensive things, and we were just the people in the cramped hall. Arthur didn't move. He didn't even look at her. He simply stepped forward and handed the small velvet box to Mark. But as he did, he caught my eye and gave a small, almost invisible wink. We finished our vows. We exchanged the rings. And when the officiant finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Mark leaned in and kissed me with a depth that made the rest of the world, Sarah, the hall, the insults, simply vanish. As we walked back down the aisle as Mr. and Mrs. the string quartet played a triumphant, swelling piece, guests stood up, clapping and cheering. For a second, I forgot about the fire Arthur had warned me about. I forgot about the $6 million key sitting in my bridal bag in the back room. But as we reached the doors to the reception area, the smell of the food began to drift in. It wasn't tacos. It wasn't DIY sandwiches. It was the smell of roasted duck, black truffles, and aged red wine. Sarah pushed past us, her face a mask of confusion. "Wait a minute," she muttered, sniffing the air. "What is that? That doesn't smell like a budget menu." She marched into the reception area first, Julian right behind her. I followed, holding Mark's hand. The tables were set with heavy silver cutlery and crystal glasses that caught the light like diamonds. But it wasn't the decor that stopped Sarah in her tracks. It was the staff. Standing by the buffet line were 12 servers in formal white and gold uniforms. On the breast of each jacket was a small embroidered crest, a silver willow tree. Sarah's face went white. She knew that crest. Every person in high society knew that crest. It was the mark of the Blackwood estate, a private service staff that money literally couldn't buy. "They only served one family. This is impossible," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling. They don't. They don't do public events. "Julian, tell me. This is a joke. Tell me they're just wearing fake uniforms." Julian was staring at the head server, a man with graying hair and a perfectly straight back. "That's Benson," Julian whispered, his voice full of genuine shock. "He's the head of the Blackwood household. My father tried to hire him for a gala last year and was told he doesn't work for new money." Sarah turned to me, her eyes wide and wild. "How did you do this, Elena? Who did you sleep with to get this staff here?" "This is a fraud. You're trying to act like you're part of a world you'll never touch." "I didn't hire them, Sarah," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. At that moment, Arthur walked into the room. He didn't say a word. He just walked up to Benson, the head server. Benson immediately bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Everything is ready for the toast, sir," Benson said. The room went so quiet you could hear the candles flickering. Sarah looked like she was about to faint. "Sir," Sarah choked out. "You're calling the gardener, sir?" Arthur turned to look at her. His expression was as calm and still as a deep lake. "The ceremony is over, Sarah. Now it's time for the speeches." "I believe you have quite a lot you want to say to everyone, don't you?" Sarah gripped her wineglass so hard I thought it would shatter. She looked at the silver willow crests, then at Arthur, then at me. The realization was starting to sink in, but her pride was still fighting to stay alive. What was Sarah going to say in her toast now that her world had been turned upside down? And why was Arthur finally letting the mask slip in front of everyone? The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from a simple wedding celebration to something heavy and electric. The guests were whispering, their eyes darting between the humble community hall walls and the elite Blackwood staff serving vintage champagne. Sarah stood at her table, her face a pale shade of gray. She looked like a trapped animal, but her pride was still her strongest instinct. She grabbed the microphone from the stand near the head table. The feedback screeched for a second, a sharp, piercing sound that made everyone wince. Sarah didn't care. She cleared her throat, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal handle. "I'd like to make a toast," Sarah said, her voice trembling but loud. "To my sister Elena." I sat next to Mark. my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt the iron key in my bag on the floor beside me. It felt like it was glowing. Everyone is very impressed by the decorations today, Sarah began, her eyes scanning the room with a bitter fire. The flowers, the staff. It's a very clever trick. My sister has always been good at pretending. She pretends she's happy with a simple life. She pretends she's content with a budget wedding. And now she's pretending that she somehow has the connections to bring the Blackwood staff into a place that smells like a middle school cafeteria. A few guests stirred uncomfortably. My mother buried her face in her hands. But let's be real, Sarah continued, her voice growing sharper, more jagged. This is just a dress-up party. Tomorrow, the flowers will wilt. These fancy servers will go back to their real masters. And Elena will go back to her tiny apartment, her cheap car, and her husband who earns less in a year than my Julian spends on a weekend in Vegas. You can put a tuxedo on a gardener, but he's still just a man who digs in the dirt. She looked directly at Arthur, her lip curling in a sneer. And you, Arthur, I don't know what kind of scam you're running. Maybe you spent your entire life savings just to embarrass me for one afternoon. Maybe you stole these uniforms. But we all know the truth. You're a nobody. And you've brought my sister into a family of nobodies. She raised her glass, her eyes glistening with a cruel, desperate triumph. To Elena and Mark. May your marriage be as lasting as these rented flowers. She took a long, dramatic sip of her wine and sat down. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one clapped. No one cheered. The air was thick with the weight of her cruelty. Sarah looked around, her chin held high, waiting for the room to acknowledge her dominance. But then, the sound of a single pair of hands clapping broke the silence. It was Arthur. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He looked at Sarah with a sense of profound, quiet observation. That was a very revealing speech, Sarah, Arthur said, his voice carrying through the hall without the need for a microphone. It was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. You've spent a lot of time today talking about what things cost, but you haven't said a single word about what things are worth. Arthur walked toward the center of the dance floor. The Blackwood staff, including Benson, stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on him with a loyalty that made the room feel even colder. You called me a nobody, Sarah, Arthur continued. You said I live in a shack and drive a truck that is beneath your notice. And you're right. I do, because I've found that the more you own, the more the things own you. I chose a quiet life. I chose the dirt, as you call it. He paused, looking at me and Mark with a softness that made my eyes sting. But I also chose to watch, Arthur said. I watched how you treated my son. I watched how you treated your own sister. I watched how you looked at your parents when they couldn't give you the glitter you demanded. I was waiting to see if there was a soul beneath that designer silk of yours. Sarah shifted in her seat, her confidence finally starting to crack. What are you talking about? Who do you think you are? Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He pulled out a small, leather-bound document. I am the man who has spent the last 30 years managing the Blackwood estate, Arthur said quietly. Not as a gardener. Not as a caretaker, but as the sole trustee and owner. The room gasped. Julian dropped his fork, the silver clattering against the china with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah's glass slipped from her hand, red wine spilling across her gold dress like a dark spreading stain. The Blackwood name isn't just a crest on a jacket, Sarah, Arthur said. It's a legacy. A legacy of people who value character over currency. And for months, I've been looking for someone to hand that legacy to. Someone who wouldn't be corrupted by it. Someone who knows that a $6 million home is just a pile of stones if there isn't love inside the walls. He turned to me, his eyes bright. Elena, you were the only one who saw me. Not the owner of an estate, but just a man. You treated me with the same kindness when you thought I had nothing as you did when you realized I had everything. That is why you have the key. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her voice a frantic, high-pitched mess. Wait, Arthur, I didn't know. I was joking. We're family. I've always said Elena deserved the best. Arthur didn't even look at her. He looked at Benson. Benson, Arthur said. Yes, sir. I think the speech portion of the evening is over, Arthur said. And I think Sarah and Julian are feeling a bit out of place. Why don't you help them find their way to the exit? Their presence is no longer required at this foundation. The room watched in total, stunned silence as the elite Blackwood staff, the very people Sarah had worshipped from afar, stepped forward to escort her out of the room. Sarah was sobbing now, a messy, ugly sound that stripped away every bit of the high society image she had spent years building. As the doors closed behind her, Arthur turned back to the room. Now, he said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. Shall we have dinner? I believe the Blackwood kitchen has prepared something quite special for my daughter-in-law. The music swelled again, but this time it was joyful. Guests began to talk all at once, the energy in the room shifting from tension to pure, unadulterated wonder. But as I sat there, holding Mark's hand, I realized that the $6 million key wasn't the biggest gift Arthur had given me. The biggest gift was the silence that now filled the space where Sarah's voice used to be. But what was actually inside the Blackwood estate? And what would Sarah do now that she had lost everything she had ever valued? The doors to the hall clicked shut behind Sarah and Julian, with a finality that seemed to echo through the very bones of the building. For a moment, the room was suspended in a strange golden silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a great storm. The air felt lighter, cleaner, and oddly still. I sat at the head table, my fingers interlaced with Mark's. I could feel the heat radiating from his palm, a steady reminder that this was real. Across the room, our guests were still frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide as they processed the reality that the simple gardener was the master of the most prestigious estate in the county. Arthur walked back to his seat with the same slow, unhurried gait he used when he was walking through his rows of hydrangeas. He sat down, adjusted his cufflinks, and picked up his glass of water as if he hadn't just dismantled my sister's entire world with a few sentences. Arthur, I whispered, my voice sounding small in the vast room. You owned all of it? All this time? Arthur looked at me, his blue eyes soft and twinkling with a hint of mischief. Wealth is a very loud thing if you let it be, Elena. But I've always preferred the quiet. I wanted Mark to grow up knowing the value of a hard day's work and the weight of a good book, not the weight of a bank account. I wanted him to find a woman who loved him for the man he is, not the shadow his father casts. Mark looked at his father, a mixture of shock and a new kind of understanding on his face. Is that why we lived in the cabin, even after Mom passed? The cabin was where your mother was happiest, Mark, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. She always said the manor was too big for two people who loved each other as much as we did. We didn't need 40 rooms to find each other. We only needed one. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. All those years, Sarah had mocked Arthur for being poor, never realizing that he was living exactly the life he wanted. He wasn't lacking money. He was lacking the desire for the things Sarah worshipped. He had traded crystal chandeliers for the stars and designer silk for the feel of honest soil. The dinner service began in earnest then. The Blackwood staff moved like ghosts in white and gold, placing plates of perfectly seared beef and delicate vegetables before each guest. The cheap community hall was now the most exclusive restaurant in the world. I watched my parents. My mother was weeping openly now, but they weren't the tears of shame Sarah had caused. They were tears of relief. My father looked at Arthur with a profound respect, perhaps realizing that the man he had almost turned his back on was the most honorable person he had ever met. You know, Arthur said, leaning toward me as the music of the string quartet filled the spaces between our thoughts. Sarah will try to come back. She'll tell you she's sorry. She'll tell you she was just stressed. She'll try to find a way to get her hands on that key. I looked down at my bridle bag where the iron key rested. I know, but the key doesn't belong to her. It never could. Exactly, Arthur nodded. That key doesn't just open a door, Elena. It opens a responsibility. The Blackwood estate isn't a trophy. It's a sanctuary. It's a place for people who have been broken by the world to find peace. It's a place for art, for nature, and for family. Sarah would have turned it into a museum of her own ego. She would have sold the willow trees to buy more diamonds. As the evening wore on, the tension that had defined my life for years began to melt away. I didn't feel like the underdog sister anymore. I didn't feel like the budget bride. I felt like a woman who had finally stepped into her own power. However, the silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sound of a heavy rain beginning to fall outside. It drummed against the roof of the hall, a rhythmic, soothing sound. I thought of Sarah out there in the cold, her silk dress ruined, her silver car probably stuck in the mud of the very dirt road she had mocked. I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of justice. She had spent her life trying to make me feel small so she could feel big. Now, the world had corrected itself. Toward the end of the night, when the guests began to say their goodbyes, Arthur walked Mark and me to the door. The air was cool and smelled of rain-washed pavement and roses. "Tomorrow morning," Arthur said, his voice low and serious. "I want you both to drive out to the manor. Don't go to the main gate. Use the small iron gate I showed you, the one that requires the key." "What's there, Arthur?" Mark asked. "Is there more to show us?" Arthur smiled, but there was a weight to it this time. The $6 million isn't in a bank account, children. And it's not just the value of the house. Inside the library of the Blackwood estate, there is a safe. And inside that safe is the real reason Sarah can never be allowed near that property. My heart skipped a beat. "What's in the safe?" Arthur patted my hand. "It's a secret your mother and I kept for 30 years. A secret about your family, Elena. Something Sarah would use to destroy your parents if she ever found it." I froze. My parents? What could be so dangerous that it had to be hidden in a $6 million fortress? "Go home," Arthur whispered. "Rest. The fire is out for tonight, but tomorrow you'll learn the truth about why I really chose you to hold that iron key." As Mark and I drove away in our old sedan, the headlights cutting through the dark, rainy night, I looked at the iron key in my lap. It felt colder than ever. I realized then that the battle with Sarah was just the beginning. The real story was hidden behind the stone walls of Blackwood, waiting for the turn of a lock. What was the secret that could destroy my parents, and was I strong enough to carry the weight of the truth? The morning after the wedding was unlike any other. The world felt scrubbed clean by the previous night's rain. Mark and I didn't head to a tropical island for a honeymoon. We didn't check into a luxury hotel. Instead, we found ourselves driving down the winding, wooded road toward the Blackwood estate. My wedding ring felt new and heavy on my finger, but it was the iron key in my purse that occupied my thoughts. We reached the small iron gate, the one hidden by ivy and shadows. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. My hands were shaking as I pulled the key out. It fit perfectly into the ancient lock. With a heavy, metallic click, the gate swung open. As we drove up the long driveway, the manor emerged from the mist like a sleeping giant. It was even more magnificent than before, now that I knew the truth, that this belonged to Arthur, and by extension, to us. It felt less like a fortress and more like a responsibility. We entered through the heavy oak front doors. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. The scent of beeswax and old paper filled the air. We made our way to the library, a room that smelled of leather and history. Arthur was there, standing by a massive mahogany desk. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. "You came," he said simply. "You mentioned a safe, Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And a secret about my parents." Arthur nodded. He walked over to a section of the bookshelf and pulled a specific volume. A panel slid back, revealing a modern, high-tech safe embedded in the stone wall. "The $6 million isn't just the house, Elena. This estate sits on a land trust that has grown for decades, but more importantly, the safe holds the truth about the debt your parents have been paying Sarah for the last 10 years. My heart stopped. "What debt?" Arthur keyed in a code, and the heavy door creaked open. He pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to me. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and a handwritten letter. As I read, the world began to tilt. 10 years ago, when Sarah married Julian, she had discovered a mistake my father had made at the mechanic shop. a clerical error that had led to a small fire. No one was hurt, but Sarah had exaggerated the evidence and told our parents she would have him arrested and sued into poverty unless they repaid her by giving her their retirement savings and a portion of their monthly income for the rest of their lives. She hadn't been helping our parents. She had been blackmailing them. She had used their fear to fund her designer lifestyle, while making me believe they were simply favoring her because she was the successful daughter. She's been draining them, I gasped, the paper fluttering in my hand. Every month. That's why they were so afraid to stand up to her. That's why she was so desperate to stop this wedding. She was afraid I'd find out. She knew I was looking into her finances, Arthur said. She tried to discredit me because she knew I had the proof. This $6 million trust, I've redirected it. It's no longer just a fund for the house. It's a legal defense and a restitution fund. Every penny she took from your parents will be returned with interest. And the rest? It's for you and Mark to ensure that no one ever makes your family feel small again. I looked at the documents. The sheer cruelty of my sister was staggering. She didn't just want to be better than me. She wanted to own our parents. Suddenly, the front door chimes rang out through the house. We looked at the security monitor. It was Sarah. She was standing at the main gate, her face red and tear-stained, screaming into the intercom. Elena, Arthur, let me in, she shrieked. Julian's father found out about the wedding. He's cutting us off. He says if the Blackwoods won't associate with us, we're a liability. You have to help me. We're family. I looked at the iron key sitting on the desk. I looked at the evidence of her 10-year betrayal of our parents. The fire Arthur had warned me about was finally here, and it was consuming the very person who had lit it. What do you want to do, Aelin? Arthur asked quietly. The key is in your hand. I walked over to the intercom. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a cold, hard clarity. I pressed the button. Sarah, I said, my voice echoing through the speakers at the gate. I know about the debt. I know about what you did to Mom and Dad. The screaming on the other end stopped instantly. There was a long, terrifying silence. I have the key, Sarah, I continued, but it only opens for people who have a foundation. You spent your life building a facade, and now the wind has blown it down. Don't come here again. The Blackwood estate doesn't recognize you. I clicked the intercom off. On the screen, I watched Sarah collapse onto the gravel of the driveway, her designer shoes finally broken, her silk dress stained by the very dirt she despised. She was alone. But as I turned back to Mark and Arthur, a new thought hit me. If Julian's father was cutting them off, Sarah would be desperate. And a desperate Sarah was a dangerous one. Arthur, I asked, is there more? You said the $6 million key was for after. After what? Arthur looked at the safe, then at me. After you realize that wealth isn't the end of the story, Elena. It's the beginning of a hunt. And Sarah isn't the only person who wants what is behind these walls. Who else was coming for the Blackwood legacy? And was our cheap wedding the reason a much larger enemy had finally noticed us? The silence that followed my final words over the intercom was the heaviest of my life. On the security monitor, I watched the small, distant figure of my sister slowly pick herself up from the dirt. She didn't look back at the camera. She didn't scream again. She simply walked toward her silver car, her shoulders slumped, moving like a woman who had finally realized the world no longer belonged to her. I stepped away from the desk and walked to the large window that overlooked the estate. The willow trees were swaying gently in the breeze, their long branches brushing against the stone walls of the manor. It was over. The secret was out. The blackmail was stopped, and the cheap bride had become the keeper of a kingdom. She's gone, Mark said, coming up behind me and placing his hands on my shoulders. It's finally quiet, Elena. I leaned back against him, but my mind was still racing. I looked at Arthur, who was calmly closing the heavy door of the safe. Arthur, you said there was a hunt. You said Sarah wasn't the only one. What did you mean? Arthur walked over to us, his face lit by the soft glow of the library's lamps. In this world, Elena, there are people like Sarah, small-minded people who want things so they can look important. They are annoying, but they are predictable. But there are others. People who understand that the Blackwood estate isn't just a house, it's a collection of land, resources, and influence that has been kept out of the hands of the greedy for a century. He took a seat in a deep leather chair, looking every bit the guardian he had been for decades. By revealing the truth at your wedding, I've signaled to the world that the Blackwood line is continuing. I've signaled that the wealth is no longer stagnant. People will come to you with deals, with threats, and with fake smiles. They will try to do to you what Sarah did to your parents, find a weakness and exploit it. I looked down at the iron key in my hand. It no longer felt like a prize. It felt like a shield. The final lesson, Elena, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone, is that money is a fire. It can keep your family warm, or it can burn your house down. Sarah let it burn her. She let her hunger for it consume her soul, until she was willing to hurt her own mother and father for a few more dollars in her bank account. He stood up and walked toward the door. I'm going back to my cabin now. The garden needs tending, and the bees don't care how many millions are in the safe. The manor is yours now. Use the restitution fund to take care of your parents. Give them back the years Sarah stole from them. And as for you and Mark, live a life that makes people wonder why you're so happy, even when you're wearing flannel and driving an old truck. Over the next few months, the fire began to settle into a steady, warm hearth. We didn't move into the manor. Instead, we turned the Blackwood estate into a community foundation. We used the grand rooms for a library, an art gallery, and a sanctuary for the very people Sarah would have looked down upon. We kept the cheap hall where we got married as a reminder of where our foundation was built. My parents were the hardest part of the healing process. When I showed them the documents and the money we had recovered from Sarah's accounts, they didn't cheer. They cried. They felt the shame of having been manipulated for so long. But with time, and the quiet support of Mark and Arthur, they began to stand tall again. They realized they weren't failures. They were victims of a daughter who had lost her way. Sarah and Julian's fall was spectacular and public. Without the secret income from my parents and the support of Julian's father, their lifestyle crumbled. They lost the mansion, the sports cars, and the friends who only loved them for their guest list. I heard through a cousin that Sarah was working as a junior assistant at a real estate firm, the very kind of job she used to mock. I didn't reach out. Some bridges are burned so thoroughly that there is no wood left to rebuild. One afternoon, a year after the wedding, Mark and I were sitting on the porch of Arthur's cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Arthur was sitting in his rocking chair, a jar of his honey on the table beside him. You did well, Elena, Arthur said, looking out at the woods. The estate is thriving, and your parents are happy. But I have to ask, do you ever miss the simple life, the one where you didn't have to carry that key? I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the stress, the insults at the bridal shop, and the cheap lilies. Then I thought about the people we had helped with the Blackwood Fund and the look on my father's face when he realized he was finally free. The life was never simple, Arthur, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. It was just quiet, and I've realized that as long as I'm with Mark, and as long as I remember the lessons of the dirt, the noise of the world can't touch me. I reached into my pocket and felt the iron key. It was warm now, heated by the sun and the weight of my own life. I realized then that the cheap wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a test of who would stay when the glitter was gone, and who would value the soul of a thing over its surface. As we sat there in the golden hour, I realized Arthur was right. The hunt for the Blackwood legacy would always be there, lurking in the shadows. There would always be another Sarah, another Julian, another greedy face at the gate. But as I looked at Mark, I knew we were ready. Because we didn't just have a $6 million key, we had a foundation that no amount of money could ever buy. And as for the safe in the library, there's still one drawer at the very bottom that remains locked. One secret that even I haven't been brave enough to look at yet. But that is a story for another time.